welcome to our video interview with Dion Devow. So Dion Devow is a Canberra-based businessman and entrepreneur who was ACT's Australian of the Year in 2018. Among many other business interests, he has his feet in the technology area with his consulting firm Yera. With the ongoing national IT focus on cybersecurity, Dion has been working with the government in his capacity as a community leader in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and he's making sure that these communities have a voice in the discussion. So we've managed to catch Dion in a very busy day, so he's strapped into his car seat and he's given us a little bit of time to have a chat. So welcome to Shearwater, Dion Devow.
Thank you very much. Thank you for reaching out and connecting.
Now, I know you've done a lot of interesting stuff and we can talk for hours about that, but I want to focus this discussion around cybersecurity in the Indigenous community, and I want to start with an overview of that relationship. Now, I know you can't put everybody into the same bucket. You know, there's Indigenous communities all throughout Australia. I mean, you're in the ACT at the moment. I know you started off in the Northern Territory, so you've got some good experience in that sort of diversity. But can you sort of generalise about the relationship between Indigenous communities and IT in general, and then we can steer the discussion towards cybersecurity a little bit?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, everybody has different needs. And when you're talking about, with respect to cybersecurity and IT, when we're talking about Aboriginal people in general, there's not like a blanket type, you know, type of community that you know, everywhere is different. There's, you know, obviously Australia has two different Indigenous cultures, that being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, spread across the country, and they're two totally different peoples. And although there are some people that are both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, like myself, that identify and are very proud of that. But you're talking about two, for the most part, two very different types of people, two distinct groups. And so they're very diverse, and then there are diversities within those two groups and cultures across the country. Some live remotely, some live in an urban setting like me. But I think one of the interesting thing about, you know, when we're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in general across the country, whether they're living in remote areas or whether they're in an urban setting, there's a lot of crossover, and most people have access to technology. Most Aboriginal communities have Wi-Fi, and if they don't have them in their homes, they may have them at their local organisations like an Aboriginal medical service, or at the local Centrelink office. So you see a lot of people on their phones, and most Aboriginal people in communities have iPhones, but they may have one iPhone that 20 people will use. So there may be two phones or two or three phones used by 20 different people, and that, when you're thinking about security and personal information, for example, that is where I think you know, we can run into some issues with respect to personal information, and even you know, when we're talking about basic entitlements like Centrelink payments, for example. So yeah, like it's really
we're becoming a lot more digital with that, and I know that yeah, we're in New South Wales, we've got the digital driver's license, we've got Service New South Wales that are pushing a big digital platform, and part of that is the identity management. Now, I know that, you know, for the past several decades, we've had a lot of issues around Aboriginal identity management. In the news recently, we've had a lot of controversy around Aboriginal identity management, and some people even calling for a register of you know, cultural heritage and various other things like this. But when you are engaging with digital platforms, you've got to have that control over the devices that you're using and the accounts that you're using, and it sounds like you just don't have that in the Aboriginal communities.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, there is, even though most Aboriginal communities do have access to IT, they do have not many Aboriginal people in communities will have a laptop or a home computer, but they will have an iPhone, or and like I said, however, the whole family will use that iPhone, and it can become a problem. And I think even when we're talking about facial recognition and things like that, I know even for my children, when they're setting up, they've both got iPhones, and when they're setting up their facial recognition to get into their iPhones, they can use each other's because their faces are similar. So do you know what I mean? So there's all those types of things within families, and especially when you're using the same device, and not everyone is honest, and so there is a potential for family members and extended family members to access other people's money and personal information, which again is a real issue, and I think that it's not really being addressed in the way that it should be, especially in Aboriginal communities. I think that Aboriginal people across the country are still really kind of a little bit behind when we're talking about cybersecurity and the need to be able to protect their personal information. So I don't think, because it's still very much a shared culture, and especially in the more traditional sense, like I said, in those remote Aboriginal communities like Maningrida and in the Tiwi Islands, and their lack of access to their own devices, there's lots of people using one device.
So is this going to create a gulf? Yeah. Is this going to create another differentiator between the regular city-based European-style communities that have access to the technology and they have the education, and the Aboriginal community?
I think definitely. Like, for example, I did some work with the Department of Human Services last year, and I was acting as a cultural consultant for them, because even the way that government thinks when they're rolling out programs and they're developing policies, and sometimes they forget about the fact that some certain groups like Aboriginal and Torres Strait people. So, for example, I'm just trying to think of the platform where your Centrelink payments, your tax, and all your medical information is all rolled into one, and that's taken carriage by Department of Human Services. They weren't really thinking about the access the lack of access that Aboriginal people had. MyGov, sorry, I just couldn't think of it there for a second. So the MyGov platform, and just in terms of migrating everybody to using that particular platform to access all of their information, whether it's Centrelink information, whether it's their information for ATO or their medical information, that they were just assuming that everyone in the country has access to IT, and that's access to computers and iPhones. And again, even though there is access to that in those remote communities, they didn't really think about the Aboriginal people that may speak not one or two Aboriginal languages. I'm talking about 9 different Aboriginal languages, and then they speak and read and write English after that. And so their numeracy and literacy might not be very good when we're talking about English, but they have all these other languages, and like I said, some of them could be speaking English as their 10th. And when they're trying to read and write and comprehend, something that might be on a Centrelink platform like MyGov, then it's just even more difficult, because they may only they might be able to read, but they may only understand the first and third and fifth words. So it's very hard for them, and it's more of a disadvantage for them, because not because of their lack of being able to use IT, it's because of the fact that they may not be necessarily being able to read and write English at a standard that's just like a year 5 or year 6 everyday Australian. Do you know what I mean? So they're very clever, and they're still able to maneuver around the system to survive, but they are still advantaged. There is a big gap. We talk about closing the gap. The IT gap is even bigger. you know, when it comes when we're talking about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community across Australia. Yeah.
We also have an interesting issue with the IT side of identity, in that,
Yes.
you know, particularly very recently with you know, members of my family who have applied for certain jobs with disadvantaged and vulnerable people. They've had to go through a lot of police checks, and in order to do that, they've had to supply a lot of documentation, and, you know, primary documentation like passports, which, you know, my kids don't necessarily have, but birth certificates and school certificates and things like this. And I know that there are a lot of people in the indigenous communities that don't necessarily have registered birth certificates, particularly the older members. Or the remote members, they may not necessarily have those things, and a lot of their identity is around their cultural ties and their community ties, and who the people in the community say they are, and how does that get captured digitally?
Well, that's exactly right, and it's still an issue, and I think it's across the board. I think I've been to Aboriginal communities where young people don't have their birth certificates, they've never been overseas, so they don't have a passport, they don't have vehicles, so they don't have a driver's license. Their information and identification is nearly non-existent, and so what a lot of the Aboriginal people in some of those remote areas in the Northern Territory I'm talking about, what they were using for their identification was their Centrelink cards, and they memorised the 16-digit because you know, Aboriginal people and our culture wasn't written. A lot of things were memorised around kinship systems and all that sort of stuff. So some of these Aboriginal people in these communities, memories are fantastic, and they would remember their 16-digit Centrelink number. It was really personal identification number. So it was really, really interesting. And that would be their only form of identification. And that was why there was an issue too when they were being told that they had to go and use this other platform to access, you know, their Centrelink payments and so forth. But yeah, it is the lack of identification is a real issue, because, you know, if you're born out in the bush, you know, a lot of them, you know, they don't have, or they don't see the importance, the value of holding on to something like a birth certificate or a passport, which is very different, obviously, to people like you and I who are living in the city, in an urban setting, and where the need for that is you know, fairly crucial, especially when we're talking about, you know, things like a driver's license. So yeah, it's a really big issue that continues to be an issue, and I think that maybe a digital identity might be a way to go. I just don't know how that would work, because you still have to have the infrastructure, and you still have to have the access to devices and all that sort of thing to be able to, you know, be identified, I suppose, and for that to work. Yeah.
Well, one way they've approached that is in India. They've launched a huge identity program in order to access government benefits and things like this, and they've got a lot of similar issues with you know, birth certificates and documentation and things. But their approach is to take biometric readings from people. So you know, multiple points of biometric readings, because, you know, obviously there are some people without fingers for fingerprints and you know, without a range of fingers for fingerprints.
Right.
So they're taking, you know, iris scans and palm prints and various other biometric readings. Are there any cultural barriers to that in Australia if we wanted to go and start cataloguing people, you know, measuring things about them, so that we get a who you are type of identity for them? Are there any cultural barriers around that sort of thing?
Look, I think so. I think there would be sensitivities in like I said, every Aboriginal community across the country is very, very different. So, but in saying that, if that sort of work is done properly in terms of the right people going into Aboriginal communities and dealing with the appropriate person, whether they're the elders in that community, or whether there's specific Aboriginal people working in organisations in that community, it's about how you engage with the community, because there needs to be like an understanding from the community's part about why this type of work is being done, why they're being asked these questions, why information about them is being captured. If they understand that, And I think it's probably not even really an Aboriginal thing. I think it's just really like a mutual kind of respect in terms of proper community consultation and community development, is that, you know, being respectful, you know, understanding Aboriginal people's positions in community, that particular community, identifying who are the appropriate people to liaise with respect to that exchange of information, so that when the time comes for an organisation or people or a company or some sort of program or scheme to be implemented through, you know, the interaction and dealing with the Aboriginal communities, and they've got an understanding of why that's happening, because there is a lot of mistrust. Indigenous Australians are still historically the most studied and questioned people in the world, and quite frankly, most of them are sick of it. So, and even in the urban setting, I get rung every year by the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, because I'm an Aboriginal person that's obviously come up, you know, as an Aboriginal person living in an urban setting in Canberra and the ACT, and I'm asked to participate in a survey every year, and I refuse to do it anymore. So that's a little bit different. But in saying that, I think that if you understand the cultural landscape and you're dealing with the right people in that community to do things like that, then it can be done. You just have to do it respectfully.
Right. Okay. So the community involvement and the community contacts brings up an interesting line of questioning now, because the reason why you and I have a relationship is via your son, Dante. So
yes,
your son just started with Shearwater last week. He's our very, very first ever trainee. So that's like an old school apprentice type of thing, but trainees are in the professions and apprentices are in the trades. So Dante's our first ever trainee. So we're quite happy with that. He's a school-based trainee because he's still young and at school. With Dante, he's also the first Indigenous employee that we've had. Now, my previous career was in teaching, so I've got a very long career in teaching. But being a course coordinator type of person and having access to people's records for the last 8 years, I've only had 2 Aboriginal students in the past 8 years. So in IT, we don't have a large Indigenous representation. So what are the barriers to getting Indigenous people into the IT area? Because if you want to solve the problems of technology and communities, you've got to have more people from those communities in IT. So how do we get that sort of thing happening?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think that there are a few different reasons why there aren't a lot of people represented in the IT space, in every area of the IT space. And that's one of the reasons why I've started both of my IT businesses, Yera and Indigimation, because when I was young and I went to a careers expo at high school, I was actually discouraged from even going to university. They had universities there, they had an IT company there, they had a few different, like there was a trade stall and other people giving advice around careers, and I have always been interested in IT and went to go and to speak to someone at that stall, and I was kind of told, well, maybe you should come over here and maybe you should think about doing a trade. And I always knew that I wanted to go to university because I'm the son of a teacher, and that was instilled into me from a very young age. Things are very different these days, but I think historically Aboriginal people haven't had access, they haven't been encouraged. We haven't had many role models in the IT space. We haven't seen many other blackfellas, working as IT professionals. And, as a people, we steer more towards things that are going to give us the ability to promote education, promote health. There's a lot of law. So there's a lot of people, Aboriginal people, that are interested in studying law, that work as Aboriginal health workers, that work trained to become teachers. And so, the social services industry there's a lot of representation when we're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. But for IT, you know, there's a lack of exposure. And I think that we need to change the mindset. We need to expose our youths and the Aboriginal people in general by providing access and pathways into the industry. I think we need to make, especially our youth, understand that it is a career that is interesting, that it's diverse. You don't have to be technical. It's broad. It can give you the opportunity to work overseas. You can make good money. And I just don't think that our people have been exposed or had an education around, you know, the IT industry as favourable and interesting and accessible career of choice. So I think we need to change it, and that's what I'm working really hard every day to do.
Okay. So when we're talking about this sort of thing, I agree with you that you can't beat what you can't see. And so having that representation in the industry is a good thing. But the problem with IT is that IT people tend to be very reserved. They don't want to be extroverted. They don't want to make a spectacle of themselves, and they definitely don't want to be the centre of attention, you know, in general. So how do we get the very, very few Indigenous people that we have in the IT industry, how do we get them to make that sort of connection with the communities? How do we get them to out themselves as Indigenous IT people?
Well, I think that there's a few ways that we can do that, and I think that that's what's so great about you know, having involvement through my businesses and connections, and helping Dante in his journey with this school-based apprenticeship with Shearwater. And I really commend Shearwater for doing this, because it's really outside of the box, and it's really innovative, and lots of people have you know, commented on this initiative. It's fantastic. But I think a lot of the times Aboriginal people can be quite shy and reserved as well. But if they are supported and encouraged and helped along the way, then I think that you know, firstly, taking a step back, we need to again be able to make opportunities and create pathways for our people to be interested and to be able to access and to get information about, you know, getting into you know, the industry. But whilst they're in there, I think there needs to be a kind of a holistic way of supporting them through. So, for example, how we're working with Dante and Shearwater is that I will be going in as a mentor and seeing, and it wouldn't, it's not just because Dante's my son, he just happened to be the first person that that has taken advantage of this opportunity. So people will follow suit. People will see that this is happening, and other kids will want to do the same thing in different IT companies like Shearwater. But I think around that, there needs to be a program that's built to support the process, to make sure that people are going in, someone like me that has cultural knowledge that can go in, make sure that the trainee, that the apprenticeship, the apprentice, whatever you would like to call it, is doing okay in that environment, that he's thriving, learning, is comfortable, that some of the cultural things are being explained to with around the employee and the employer as well, because there are things that are cultural that can take and affect Aboriginal people in a workplace. For example, if there's sorry business, if there's a funeral, a lot of our people live in remote communities in the Northern Territory, and for example, our families are in, you know, we have family, you know, in the Torres Strait, and it might take you 3 days to get there. So if you're talking about things like that sorry business, when people go, oh, we don't need, it's just a funeral, you just go, you know, the person dies, you'll go to a funeral next week and it's done and dusted. But there are some people in some communities that it takes 3 or 4 days just to travel to get there, and then there are certain cultural obligations that, you know, you might have to stay there for a week. So that affects, you know, the employee in the workplace, that affects your team because you're not there. And then if you don't understand as an employer or a manager why that Aboriginal person has gone for so long, and again, it differs from community to community, then you probably think, oh, well, they're just going walkabout. And that's where these kind of embedded institutional kind of ignorant stereotypes can come into play and affect an Aboriginal or an individual in a workplace setting, whether they're a trainee or whether they're someone that's worked for 20 years in an organisation. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's a holistic approach that needs to happen where there's a supported environment the non-Indigenous workplace is supported, but so is the Indigenous employee or trainee or cadet, whatever you want to call them. And that's what we're going to do with Shearwater.
Now, I've got 4 kids, but 3 of them are girls, and when the girls were going through school, there was a big push to get the girls into STEM sort of careers. Now, they haven't ended up in those careers, and that's fine, but they've had that exposure to those sorts of careers with things like She Codes and Coder Academy and various other things like this, DigiGirls and all these other sorts of programs. Now, I know that you've got some insight into some of the government programs they're setting up for Indigenous youth in that particular area. So what's on the agenda? What's the government doing in order to push IT into the Indigenous communities?
Well, I'm not sure that they're doing I don't think there are many specific Indigenous STEM programs. If there are, I haven't come across a large number of them. I'm definitely doing my own part around trying to expose Aboriginal kids, both male and female, to IT. For example, I'm doing some work with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, to develop Indigenous cyber camps, Indigenous cyber camps, we're calling them, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait children. We ran our pilots from Questacon here in Canberra, which is a pretty cool organisation and very appropriate in terms of the setting and trying to incorporate science and technology and education and mathematics. And so ages from 9 to 13, and we had, I think, 17 or 18 Indigenous kids, both boys and girls, and their parents come and participate. So I think it's little things like that that will, into the future, make a difference. And after, and we engaged IT professionals to come and take conduct and undertake the workshops. And, even speaking and interviewing these young kids, they had an idea and had an interest, and it kind of made them understand, well, what they could do with that into the future, and even gave them information around, making sure that they were being smart around protecting their own personal information on their Instagram accounts, on their Facebook accounts, and TikTok. So, again, I think we need to tap into the resources, whether they are specific STEM funding that the federal government has. We need to kind of tap into that to encourage the Indigenous community to pursue, careers under that banner, and we need to do that across the board. So I think there's not enough being done, but we can really start to change that and look at that. And I think more of an awareness needs to be made known to the community in general that this is an opportunity to make some changes and to do some really cool things to get kids into the mindset that this is an industry that that they can participate in.
So, thank you very much for your time today, Dion. If people want to contact you and see your wonderful empire of entrepreneurial activities in design and IT and all the other sort of things that you've got your fingers into, where's the best place to find information about Dion Devow?
You can find it at www.darkiesdesigns.com.au or www.yera, which is yewra.com.au. But because I've got so many things going, you probably just Google me. I'm pretty Googleable, if that's a word. If you just typed in Dion Devow, then something would come up that would lead to one of the things that I'm doing. So love to connect with people, and another awesome way that we can use technology to stay connected and learn.
And if you need any help with the cybersecurity side of things, to talk to shearwater.com.au. And we know that we've got a Devel family member working there at the moment, and hopefully we'll have a whole heap more Indigenous youths coming on board in future years. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, well done, Shearwater.
Much appreciated.
Thank you, buddy.